Hello, Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Shalom. We're from Universal God Message of Peace. This is Dr. Zaheer and Rabbi Weissman, and we're going to be continuing our talk this week on the topic of marriage and divorce. So over to you, Dr. Zaheer. Please tell us what the Qur'an says about marriage and
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Lali, and thank you very much, Dr. Weissman. I just want to say at the outset that, this space that Dr. Lale has created is a great opportunity for us, people belonging to different religious traditions, to come together and to talk to each other and understand each other in an environment where it's mutually respectful and we are polite and we are understanding, and our message is that that's how people should live together and interact with each other. I'll try to be brief in trying to describe the marriage laws and the laws of divorce in Islam. You mentioned, Dr. Lale, in Quran. Well, I would say in Islam, and I'll tell you the reason why. Mm-hmm. When it comes to the question of marriage, you don't find a great deal mentioned in the Quran as to how it should proceed. And the reason is that when it comes to the teachings of Islam, we have two sources, equally important sources. One is the Quran and the other is the Sunnah. While the Quran is pretty much clear that it has 114 chapters, beginning from Al-Fatiha, ending with Nas, and it's a fully preserved book of God, fully preserved because it was memorized from the very beginning. As far as Sunnah is concerned, there is considerable disagreement about what constitutes Sunnah. So I have to just briefly clarify that my understanding of Sunnah is that it is, like the Quran, equally reliable and authentic. The Quran is authentic because we believe, we understand that the Quran was agreed upon by the first generation of Muslims, all of them, that this is what the Quran is from A to Z. And this agreement has been transmitted to the next generations in a way that there has been no gap. So we call it ijma, consensus, and tawatur, uninterrupted continuity. But this is a text. It has words. The other aspect of the religion of Islam is, and obviously when I'm talking about Islam, I'm talking about the message delivered by Prophet Muhammad, and we understand that he was the last prophet. The other aspect is the Sunnah, which is the religious practices which he introduced. Well, he reintroduced. These religious practices were already there amongst the religious people of the surroundings. The Quran doesn't claim that Islam is a new religion, was initiated by the messenger who is attributed to Islam. The Quran claims that all prophets brought the same message. Islam must have been known by a different name because obviously the languages were different. And the Quran binds the prophet to follow the religion and religious way of Prophet Abraham. That's what the Quran says. So what we have in religious practices like formal prayers, like Hajj, pilgrimage, etc., they're all practices. And like the Quran, we think that they were unanimously agreed upon by the first generation of Muslims, and that agreement was transmitted to the subsequent generations in a way that there is no gap. It's uninterrupted continuity. Now, what we find regarding uh, regarding marriage, which we call nikah, is to be found in Sunnah and not the Quran. By the way, there is a disclaimer. What I'm going to say, obviously, is going to be my understanding. And I have reasons to believe that my understanding is what I think is right. But obviously, anybody can question and dispute it. Um, what we find regarding nikah, regarding marriage, in the Sunnah is, as I said, in the Quran, there are very few mentions, and I'll let you know what they are. But what we understand from the Sunnah is that a marriage between a man and a woman, and by the way, it has to be between a man and a woman, it can only take place if the two have given their consent. They are they agree to it without any coercion, without being pressurized. Uh, and this consent is then made public. So that is what requires a ceremony normally. And, relatives from both sides are there. The minimum condition is that uh, the number should be reasonable enough for the announcement to be genuine. When you talk about the minimum number, then we are actually entering into the arena of scholarly opinions. But the idea is that the announcement should be made. In the announcement, uh, the groom, the husband to be, announces or requires the announcement to be made on his behalf is that he is giving a certain amount or certain value as gift, uh, dower money. Uh, and the idea is that because he is going to take uh, charge of the financial obligations of the household, therefore he is making that beginning and he commits himself to playing that role. Uh, if we find anything in the Quran, uh, it's actually regarding the conditions of marriage, uh, and primarily the conditions are that the woman who is going to be married should not already be in the marriage nikah of some other man. So, I mean, either she is a virgin or she has been divorced and the divorce proceedings have been completed. We'll talk about it, what they are. Or she's a widow, and after having been a widow, she has completed the waiting period, which is generally speaking 4 months and 10 days. So, but the other conditions, two conditions, and here there is a dispute uh, amongst Muslims, but my understanding is very clear from the Quran that there are only two conditions, quite apart from the conditions that I've mentioned about the uh, the bride, wife to be. One condition is that both partners or partners to be should believe in one God. So they have to have this understanding of oneness of God shared by them. And the second condition is that they both should be chaste. They should, in other words, not be involved in uh, extra affairs, marital affairs. If these two conditions are fulfilled, satisfied, then a Muslim man can get married to any lady, and a Muslim woman can get married to any man. Now, this second part of the statement that I've made is not agreed upon by most Muslims, but I feel I feel fairly confident that this is what the Quran is saying. These two conditions are to be met, whether a man or a woman, he or she is a Muslim, he can get married. And as I said, the marriage is going to take place wherein there's going to be an announcement made, uh, and it should be consented by both parties, and uh, the the husband to be will take the responsibility of the household as far as its financial matters are concerned. Uh, Other than that, honestly, there are customs, and each society has its own customs. There's nothing that our religion stops people from following those customs, so long as they're not unnecessarily extraordinarily lavish or indecent. But obviously, I mean, this is something that has to do with the tastes of the people who are involved, etc. Right. So the marriage has taken place. Now we come to divorce. Uh, the Quran mentions that divorce is to be given by the husband. If a wife would want to seek divorce, she will ask her husband to divorce her. And if he refuses, it's then that she has a right to go to the court of law and demand that their formal relationship should come to an end. Um, in the first case, when the husband pronounces divorce, there again are lots of disputes, and I kind of keep dealing with cases on almost a daily basis. There are husbands who make the statement that I divorce you, and they are out of sheer anger. They're emotional, they are upset, they have a dispute. And there are many, many scholars who say that once you have made that statement, uttered those words, it's all over. And you receive calls and messages of ladies crying, husbands, you know, extremely embarrassed, shamed, and depressed. But the fact of the matter is that the Quran is very clear in its statement that when a divorce is to be pronounced, it should be done with proper intention. The person who is making that pronouncement really means it. And the Quran also sets forth a few conditions. One condition, obviously, I mentioned that it should come from the husband in a way that he really means it. It should not come in a way that he's just uttering words out of emotional, frenzy because he's angry. Like people use abusive words, in our culture, unfortunately, uh, to threaten wives or to just insult them. These words are also used, so they would not constitute uh, divorce. So if the divorce has been pronounced with proper intention, and there is no harm if a society legislates that it should be done in writing or that there should be two witnesses, it's not necessarily a condition, but there is nothing wrong if things are going wrong in a certain society because of the misuse of the right that the husband has. Certain measures can be done, can be undertaken. Uh, the husband has also been asked to make sure that when he's divorcing his wife, he should take into consideration the fact that she is in her clean period, is not in her menses. And the clean period is the one wherein he has not had physical relations with her. Now, these two conditions, which are pretty much clear, uh, are a good reason to believe that this decision has not been taken in haste,
Mm.
and it's not out of anger or rage that the person has made that pronouncement. He's actually thought about it. And then the next condition that the Quran sets forth, which I can tell you hardly anybody follows, sadly. It is a clear violation of the Quranic principle which has been clearly mentioned, which gets violated by hundreds and thousands of Muslims. I'm sad to say, on a daily basis. And that condition is when a husband divorces his wife, and I've mentioned the conditions that need to be taken into consideration. He has to keep his wife, divorced wife, in his own home residence. Neither is the wife allowed to run away, nor is the husband allowed to force her to go away. They will live under the same roof. Obviously, they'll not be in the same room. And the Quran mentions the reason is that you never know. He might change his mind. Uh, and Also, the reason is that during this period of waiting period, which the Quran mentions is 3 periods of menses. So, salasata quru. So, what it means is that the husband has pronounced divorce and the wife is in her clean period. And then comes her first, and then the second, and then the third menses. That is the waiting period. Now, the idea is that within this period, it would become very clear whether the lady is pregnant or not. If she is already pregnant, then the waiting period is going to end when the pregnancy would terminate. But if she's not pregnant, then it would end at the end of the third menses. Now, during this period, the husband can reconcile. And what it means is that, well, he would say that, well, I've reconsidered my opinion and it's all over. However, because this permission to the husband can actually be used by him to, to cause torture to his wife, to cause harm to her, mental harm, by doing it over and over again. The reason is good. The reason is that the Almighty would not want people, husbands, to take hasty decisions and then to regret later in a way that they've got no options left. The lady is gone and she's married to somebody else and the harm has already been done. So this duration has been allowed, but it has been allowed only twice. So if a husband pronounces divorce and reconciles within the waiting period, one of the two options are consumed. Now he has another option. He can again divorce. Well, he should not, but if he has, again, he is going to go through the same process. And within the waiting period, if he again reconciles, then he has consumed both options. Now, if he pronounces divorce, seriously, then he will not be allowed to reconcile. And probably, now this is not mentioned, but it's very likely that in this third case, he may not need to live under the same roof because now there is no possibility of reconciliation. That's about all. The last thing I would say is that, it is because of this understanding that we get from the Quran that there are many husbands, sadly, I mean, so sad, that they pronounce divorce and say it thrice in one breath, thereby, giving this message that the two permissions to divorce and reconcile that the Almighty has given to us, we don't want it. We give you 3 divorces in one go and get lost. Now, this is a big sin. this is a clear violation of the norms that the Almighty has set forth. So there is a big dispute amongst Muslims. At the time of the Prophet, God's mercy be on him, at the time of the first Caliph Abu Bakr, this was the norm. It is said, and I still struggle to reconcile why it really happened, but it is said that in the case of the second Caliph, sometime during his reign, he got he got upset with the fact that people have started pronouncing divorce 3 times in one go. So he announced, so goes the understanding, so goes the historical mention, that he announced that enough is enough. If from now on any husband is going to pronounce divorce thrice, I'll do 2 things. One, I am going to implement it as a divorce that is irreconcilable. So it's going to be parting of ways between the husband and wife. And B, that silly person is going to be flogged before the public. Now, it is said, was a decision taken by the second caliph. And what happened later, unfortunately, was that the first decision became a part of the ruling or law that many Muslim scholars started following. But the second part, the flogging part, was ignored. And therefore, what we have now, a very common scenario, as I said, it happens on a daily basis. Hundreds and thousands of people, they do it. They say that I give you talaq, 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 divorce, divorce, divorce. And people from surroundings, including scholars, they come and they say it's all over. Sorry, it's all over. You know, the family has broken. So that's it. That's what is the law of marriage and divorce, as I understand.
I have so many questions. I have
I'm nervous.
questions, but I want to start out with a comment, and that is that you said something that I think that was very very salient and important, and that is that, you know, on the one hand you have the text, and you have the kind of intention of the text, and then you have in the execution, sometimes in the execution there needs to be some kind of modification in behavior in order for the intention of the text to actually be executed. So, and I know that there's, you know, I understand there's difference between the different madhabs, that there's different schools of interpretation and certainly in different places and local customs and things like that when it comes to, especially when it comes to marriage. I think, you know, when you see these, you know, these weddings, you know, the weddings in Morocco and the weddings in Pakistan, the weddings in Turkey, they follow basically the same principles, and the nikah is basically the same, but all the other stuff, the walima and this and all these other things that, you know, that go along around them are different. But that the safeguards, you know, the safeguards that sometimes things have to be done to safeguard that the intention is met is really important. And the issue I never thought about what you said is really interesting. You know, that the 3 times, right? The 3 times was to give you 3 different opportunities, right? Yeah, right. Is to give you 3 different opportunities, and it may, and that I know that some Islamic states have kind of made rules and said, you know, listen, there is no such thing as 3 times, right? That it's, you can say 3 times, right? But that 3 times is only 1 time, right? I think, right? It says that, you know, you cannot say it all together. You have to give yourself, you have to space it out. And I think that makes eminent sense. Makes eminent sense to give people, you know, the opportunity to you know, to recant and to rethink their decision. So I have a strange question. Well, first of all, I also thought it was interesting that you said, certainly the question about whether believers can marry one another is a very interesting question to me. The Torah prohibits, for example, so the Torah prohibits marriage with the 7 nations, right? The 7 Canaanite nations. And then it gives a reason, which the Torah doesn't always give a reason, but it gives a reason. It says, because you will follow after their gods, right? So that's the prohibition. You're not allowed to marry the 7 idolatrous Canaanites, and because you'll go after their gods, meaning that they're idolaters. So based on that, right? So based on that, one would come to the conclusion, oh, well, then anybody who's not of the 7 nations, right, who's not of these idolatrous nations, who's a believer in God, then you should be able to marry them. The rabbis didn't like that. The rabbis didn't like that, thought that it was giving too much room, and they said, no, this applies to everybody. You can only marry Jewish people. But it is interesting that that is not what the Torah says, and it's worth noting. And it's also interesting. My assumption was always that the Qur'an specified the difference between men and women when it came to marrying other believers, people of the book, but that's not true.
Now, that's a good question. You see, that's why I nervously mentioned that this is, where many people would disagree with me. But
I
let me
admired your nervousness. I admired that. You were brave and nervous at the same time. I was very impressed.
Let me tell you the reason. You see, there are 2 relevant verses, one in the 2nd chapter and the other in the 5th chapter. The verse in the 2nd chapter says, do not, addressing both Muslim men and women, first telling Muslim men, do not get married to the women who have polytheistic beliefs.
Okay.
And goes on to say that a slave girl who is a believing slave girl is much better than a lady who is otherwise free but believes in several gods. And likewise, the same mention is made for believing women. Do not get married to a polytheist man. A slave man is better than a free polytheist man. Now, that's what one verse says. Here, there is no distinction between man and woman. Both have been prohibited from getting married to those who are polytheists, whether man or woman. Now, in the chapter number 5, the mention is that the ladies belonging to the people of the book, that is the Jews and the Christians, if they are chaste, they are lawful for you. That's what the mention is. Now, the popular implication, which many scholars have come up with, is that the Almighty has allowed Muslim men to get married to non-Muslim women belonging to the category of Jews or Christians, provided that they are chaste. And it's a permission not allowed to Muslim women when it comes to the Jews and the Christian men. I had been influenced by this understanding for quite a while. But honestly, I've come to this understanding that it doesn't make sense. For anything to be prohibited, there has to be a clear mention. If you look at the 2 verses together, when in one verse, the condition of belief in one God has been mentioned as an important, inviolable principle for you to look for in your spouse to be. And there's no difference of man and woman mentioned over there. Then in the second verse, if this permission has been given to men, it should be inferred that the same permission is available to women as well. Uh, Obviously, had this permission not been available, then it should have been clearly mentioned. Uh, but, the Muslim world in general and a large number of Muslim scholars, they hold the view that this possibility is not available to Muslim women.
I understand. It
Yeah.
is interesting. Your approach is interesting. I mean, in the sense that, allowing the verses to speak to each other, right? Allowing the
Right.
verses to speak to each other is interesting, and that one of them clearly has a much broader application than the other, much more narrow. It's interesting. I think, by the way, I think it's a fundamental issue in religious law is deciding what you need to prohibit something, right? I mean, it's a big deal to prohibit something, right?
No, that's
We don't realize God gave us free will, right? God gave us free will, and to prohibit something is much more, is much heavier than to say something is permitted. It's taking a lot more on yourself in some respects.
and therefore it should be pronounced most clearly.
Right. Because it's taking away the one fundamental thing that God gave you, right?
Yeah.
It has to be pretty clear to make something into. So it's interesting. So now I have another question. Okay, so this is a more complicated question, probably. So, a few years ago, I had a conversation with a friend of mine who's a Sheikh Bazaga, who was a sheikh in Mission Viejo, California at the time, and we were talking about temporary marriages. And he was Sunni. He was not. He didn't, and this was not really in his experience, honestly. But he had come to America, right? He had come to America, and in America, sexual mores and relationships were very different, right? People lived together, all sorts of different kinds of arrangements, and he was trying to work out for himself what he thought about temporary marriage as a means of dealing with those kinds of issues. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and obviously it's a question that we continue to talk about and struggle with. My understanding is that for marriage to be valid, when you are going for it, when you are formalizing it, your intention is that you are going to live with your spouse for as long as you live or as long as he or she lives. So it's a lifetime project.
Mhm.
However, there is always this possibility of divorce to end the relationship. But at the time when you are getting married, you cannot intend to say that we are getting married only for 6 months or a year. However, there are situations when, as you rightly pointed out, that you find yourself not comfortable if you're going to live in a certain society uh, without a legitimate woman, to give you, her company, and vice versa for the lady. There's every likelihood that you're going to fall prey into evil ways. So, what should be done then? Uh, and obviously, a very uh, clear case in point is the case of students who go
Mhm.
abroad. I mean, they've got to spend something like 4 or 5 years They are young. They find that the atmosphere is tempting. It's difficult for them to resist, and they need to do something about it. So my understanding is that the view of some of the scholars makes sense. That, for instance, if there is a student from Malaysia and there's a student from Pakistan, and they're both studying in the United States of America at a university, and they come together and they decide that, look, we're getting married. But let's face it, at the end of this 4 years period, it's very likely that I'm going to go to Malaysia and you're going to go back to Pakistan. We don't know what's going to happen, but we'll decide then. We know that the decision could be either way. We might continue, we might not continue.
Mm-hmm.
But our intention right now is that as much as is possible, we'll try to continue to have this formal relationship for as long as it would last. The problem with temporary marriage is that if you allow it, which some Muslims do allow, some people put certain conditions, then it's really very difficult to distinguish it from prostitution. And it would be interesting for you to know, probably you already know it, that many prostitutes in Muslim countries, they actually, in order to satisfy their conscience, they actually enter into a temporary marriage contract each time they deal with a client. Which, obviously, if you look at the law, if you look at the relationship, if it is made permissible, it could be for 6 months. Then why can it not be for 6 days? Why can it not then be for 6 hours? So then obviously it really turns into a joke. So I think marriage, whenever it takes place, the intention is for it to last for as long as one of the two spouses would last. But there is always a possibility of it getting terminated through divorce, which is what one of the two spouses would resort to as and when they feel that it's not getting along the way they intended. But at the time of marriage, that should never be the intention.
Yeah, I agree with you. At the same time at the same time, part of me appreciates the desire of somebody to make halal something that might otherwise be haram. But still, it's an interesting topic. We don't have such a thing. Although we do have. There was in ancient times. A second kind of marital relationship, which is not exactly a wife. It's called a plagesh. I guess maybe you would translates as concubine, in which you had restricted marital duties. Like, so you didn't necessarily have the same responsibilities towards them that you would have towards an actual wife. And they don't necessarily have the same, so there was, and that actually I think could be temporary. I believe that could be temporary. So there was such an arrangement. A few years ago, some rabbi in New York suggested this would be a great solution to the problem with there are young women who can't get married. He says, well, we could just go back to this. It didn't actually pan out. Nobody went for it, so it didn't gain any traction.
But can I say something?
Yeah,
there is this ongoing discussion amongst some Muslims and scholars as well, that the mention of the possibility of slave girls who, let's face it, the way it has been mentioned in the Qur'an, they are at least half wives, and physical relations with them is possible. So there are some people who argue that it's mentioned in the Quran as there's no clear mention that it has been outlawed. Right. So that point of view is there as well. I believe that it's not applicable anymore, and I have reasons to believe that. But uh, as far as their understanding is concerned, that there has to be a verse prohibiting that arrangement. And
Right.
in the absence of that verse, well, we can have them.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean the Torah also permits slavery, and it's complicated also, because if you keep a woman slave, you can also marry her in some conditions. You actually have to marry her. I mean, so it's complicated. And yeah, there is no specific prohibition, but just people stop practicing it, and it's interesting because you have to adapt. The reason why I asked the question about temporary marriage was partially because one of the things that I understand from you and your approach is, the realization that we do have to kind of deal with new situations. Right.
Correct.
I mean, the college students is a really good example. That is a relatively new situation. And the question is, what do you do with that? Can you create for those people, good example, right? They're going to go back to Malaysia. Their parents are likely to marry them to whoever they want to marry them to. They're going to go back to Pakistan. They're going to marry whoever the family chooses. But in the meantime, right? What do we want them to do? Ideally speaking, right, we would want them to control themselves but that's a lot to ask of an 18-year-old kid, right?
That's
Who's,
right.
thousands of miles away from home. So then the question is, how do you, what can you do, both legally and spiritually, to kind of help them along in that. And that's, if that involves kind of redefining marriage, I think that's interesting and dangerous, as you said. It's really, it's also very dangerous, because if that becomes the norm, we don't ever want the norm to be for people to think of marriage as temporary, right? We want the norm to be that people think of marriage as a lifelong commitment, right?
My understanding is just brief statement. My understanding is that, the traditional understanding of scholars, which obviously should always be respected because they were very pious, God-fearing, and bright people who had a lot of learning and insight, uh, sometimes needs to be revisited because they have not faced the kind of situations that new times throw at us, as you rightly pointed out, like talking about students, etc. And my understanding is that when you look at the text, given the new environment, the text would provide you with opportunities without it necessarily getting bent or altered.
Right.
The text remains intact, but you are able to find space in it, something which the elders did not find, not because they were not intelligent, not because they did not have depth of knowledge, but because they had not faced those situations.
Right. Right.
So that's
And
what my understanding is.
I think that's a very healthy understanding. I wish more religious people had that understanding, because religion is made to live with, right?
That's right.
It's made to be livable. If it's not livable, then it's not doing its job. It has to be livable. And this was a very
If it
interesting
if
conversation.
it's not livable, then it has outlived its utility.
Right. Right. And that's what you see. And honestly, I feel like, I'll complain for a second. I mean, I feel like I think many people leave religion because not because they haven't found something good there, but because they haven't found room for themselves there,
I
and
agree. I agree.
and we have an expression. Whenever you want to say somebody has become not religious, you say they're off the derech. Derech is tariq, is the path. They're
All
off the
right.
path,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
They're off the path. So the problem is usually that the path was too narrow, right?
That's right.
If somebody goes off the path, it's because they didn't know that the path was wide enough to include them. And so I think it's very healthy to
I keep saying to people that, probably you might disagree, that this phenomenon of emerging atheism, I say it's a reaction to the traditional religion, which is
entirely.
yeah,
No,
absolutely.
entirely. It's the generations before that were hit with sticks.
Absolutely.
The between the generations before that were hit with sticks and the answer that the book says so without any other explanation, between those two, in an age of information, those are both deadly.
Dr.
Honestly.
Weissman, where is Dr. Lale? I think she's disappeared.
It's very quiet. It's very quiet today.
I'm so sorry. I I had to mute it because my dog is barking in the background. You might hear. I do have a couple of questions, but I'm aware we've only got 10 minutes left. If you're happy, I can ask one of them and
All right, please go ahead. Go ahead.
one of them was about the I would like you to talk a little bit about the issue of having 4 wives, if that's okay for the
Okay.
audience, because I've had some conversations with some people. I know you the Sunnah, and because Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had more than one wife at times, and so some people encourage it as if it is better, but obviously in the Qur'an it says that one is better for you, if only you knew. So this is just an issue a topic that I'd like to talk about. What is your opinion on this, please?
Right. Obviously, it in itself is a long topic in its own right. You see, the discussion on the marriages of the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, is a separate topic. He got married to only one woman for a good part of his life, who was older to him by a number of years. And then came the time of his life, his career, wherein on the one hand he had to take care of his daughters, and he was a busy person himself. And thereafter, there were the needs of the faith to be promoted in a society where, by getting married to women, it was more possible to approach families and other people. And each of his marriages can be explained as a response to a certain need of his prophetic mission. So it's a completely separate issue. When it comes to the permission of men getting married to 4 women, honestly, that's not the right statement. The right statement is that men were getting married to more than one wives for ever since, right from the beginning. So it's not that Islam has allowed men to get married to more than one woman. It was something that was happening in history. Islam or the Quran did 2 things. A, it restricted the number to 4 and mentioned that too is only possible, is only going to be allowable if they're all treated equally. And in addition, there is a third, I would say, condition, which has quite often is ignored, that there has to be a social need for it. Like in the case of Battle of Uhud, there were some 70 Muslims who got killed, and they left behind orphans and widows. And the Quran mentions this particular aspect of getting more than one wife in that context.
Mhm.
And, the same way we mention the case of some countries in world wars, there was a large number of men who got killed. So, I mean, the societies were left with a big number of women and very few men that were there to get married to. So there could be occasions when it becomes necessary for a man to get married to more than one woman. However, there are two reasons. There are two reasons why I believe that in Islam, one man getting married to one woman
Mhm.
is the norm and the ideal. But getting married to more than one woman can sometimes be uh, necessary, unavoidable. And there could be different reasons. The two reasons are A, had God wanted one man to be ideally getting married to more than one woman,
Mhm.
it should have been shown right at the beginning of the advent of humans coming to this world. Adam should not have had one Eve. He should have had more than one wife. And number two, you could do a Google search and you look at the demographic divide of men and women in different countries of the world. I tried it, maybe I was wrong, but I was able to have a look at the figures that were given. I don't know how reliable they are. All countries of the world, all countries have equal population of men and women. In actual fact, in almost all countries of the world, the male population is slightly higher, except for one country. I don't know why, Kazakhstan, there was slightly women are greater in number. So now the second reason that I give is that had it been the Almighty's intent to encourage men to have more than one wives, then he should have shown it in the manner he arranged for males and females to come to this world. So I think it's not a norm. It's not something that is encouraged. It's something that has been allowed, and it has been allowed for reasons which sometimes can be unavoidable.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Rabbi Weissman, do you have any more questions?
No, I have no more questions. I enjoyed that answer very much. I think it's very telling that sometimes what is permitted is not the ideal.
Right.
There are things which things which one may do are not necessarily what one should do. And that's a pretty good example. And I think there are circumstances under which it makes a lot of sense. And there are, many circumstances which does not make a lot of sense. I think, especially, in the West also, it's difficult to pull off. I think I've known very few people who have been able to pull it off well. So
Yeah, it is. I agree.
not,
I agree.
not so recommended.
That's right.
Oh, it's a very big topic, isn't it? We can go on and on about it. And
So let's talk about the next time's topic, if we may. And obviously, now that I've done my job, it's Dr. Weissman is going to take up the task of talking about whatever the next topic is.
Well, let's work it out in the chat. We can work it out in the chat, and we'll figure out what the next thing is, and
That's a good idea. Yeah.
and we'll be back, and we'll do our thing.
Good. Thank you very much.
Assalamu
Okay.
alaikum. Shalom.
Wa alaikum assalam and shalom.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.